very special warm welcome to our first Doherty Q&A, and I am going to be your Tony Jones for the next hour. I wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we are meeting upon, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also welcome any Indigenous Australians here today. As I look across the room, I can see many familiar faces, but I think we've also got some new visitors to the Institute, so a very warm welcome to the Doherty. My name's Sharon, Lewin, and I'm Director of the Institute. And if this is your first time here, please stay, please talk to some of our staff and learn about the great things that we're doing here. Was that Peter already upstanding me? I was going to introduce the rules of today. One of them was that as Tony Jones, I get to determine who speaks and who doesn't, and I'm the boss and in complete control. I just want to make sure that Peter knows that right now. We had the idea for holding this event after the very successful visit when Michael Kirby came to the Institute in November 2017. It was a very well-attended and very enjoyable and stimulating session. I was Michael Parkinson then. I've become Tony Jones this time. We were very keen for Michael to come back, and we thought we would use a different format. I should say, when I think back about November 2017, and for those of you that were here at that last time we chatted to Michael and Peter, it was about a week before the Marriage Equality Survey came out. We had a few questions about marriage equality, and of course there was the landmark Voice of Australia in support of marriage equality, which became legal in January of 2018. And I should just start by saying that Michael married his partner of 50 years, Johan, just 3 weeks ago. So congratulations to Michael. So I would like to first of all start by welcoming and formally introducing our guests for today, and a special welcome to Christine Kilpatrick. Many of you will know that Christine is the CEO of Melbourne Health. She's been in that role since May 2017, and prior to that has held many important executive appointments, including Chief Executive of the Royal Children's Hospital for over 10 years, the Executive Director of Medical Services at Melbourne Health, and Executive Director of Royal Melbourne Hospital back in 2004 to 2008. She brings an extraordinary set of skills to the job. She's also a neurologist specialising in epilepsy, so truly understands the challenges of medical care, research and education, and I know is very, very committed to an excellent public hospital system. She's also very active in many other areas. She's a member of several boards, including Origin, the National Centre of Excellence in Youth Mental Health, the Walter and Liza Hall Institute, and the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre. She has a long list of awards, and I'll just mention a few. She was awarded a Centenary Medal in 2003. In 2014, she was included in the Victorian Honour Roll of Women. In 2017, was a recipient of the inaugural Distinguished Fellows Award from the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators, and in 2018, inducted in the top 50 public sector women. So extraordinarily accomplished, a fantastic role model for women, and welcome to Christine Kilpatrick. Laureate Professor Peter Doherty needs no introduction. He's our patron. He kindly gave his name to our wonderful institute, and as I'm sure everyone agrees, is a great Australian. Peter was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1996, together with Ralph Zinckernagel, for their discoveries in understanding the specificity of killer T cells. He's the only vet to have ever won a Nobel Prize. I often tell people that fact, especially vets that I meet, and continually inspired by Peter. Peter is a companion of the Order of Australia, and after a long and distinguished career in science, he now describes himself as a writer, and many of us have enjoyed his many excellent books. I know that Peter has many adoring fans, not just in the world of science, but in the world of climate change, and he's a fantastic public intellectual in Australia. So please join me in welcoming Peter Doherty. And finally, a very special guest for today, the Honourable Michael Kirby. Justice Michael Kirby is one of Australia's most eminent and admired public figures. He's widely known for his tireless efforts in international human rights, LGBTQI rights, and his leadership in the response to HIV. When he retired from the High Court of Australia in 2009, he was Australia's longest serving judge. But in addition to his judicial duties, he has done much more. He has served on 3 university governing bodies, being elected Chancellor of Macquarie University in Sydney. He's also served on many distinguished national and international bodies, including the WHO's Global Commission on AIDS, the International Commission of Jurists, the UNESCO International Bioethics Committee, the UNAIDS Reference Group on HIV and Human Rights, and the UNDP Global Commission on HIV and the Law. Justice Kirby is also a companion of the Order of Australia and companion of the Order of St Michael and St George. He's the patron of 2 very important institutes within Australia. The first, the Kirby Institute at UNSW, an institute that we share many common interests. And I wanted just to acknowledge the difficult year the Kirby Institute has had and the leadership that Michael provided, with David Cooper unfortunately dying in March of this year. The Kirby Institute's recently appointed their new director, Professor Tony Kelleher, that we are very much looking forward to working closely together. Michael also has another centre named after him. It's the Michael Kirby Centre for Public Health and Human Rights, based at Monash, and a very special welcome to Bibi Loft, the director who's here today. So please join me in welcoming Michael Kirby. So before I start by describing the format, do we have any Q&A addicts here? People that like to watch Q&A every week? Not many. I'm surprised. I should have put my hand up. I am a bit of an addict. I really enjoy the show. The format is that we have some questions from the audience, and I'll call on audience members to deliver those questions. Every week on Q&A there's a few video questions. We don't have those. Every week on Q&A there's always a few politicians, and we luckily don't have any of those. And most recently, especially those that have watched for a while, Tony Jones has introduced this new thing that he only lets people speak for 1 minute. I'm not going to implement that unless I really want things to move on. So you have as much freedom as you want to talk. We won't have every member of the panel comment on every question. I'll direct the questions as they come in, and I'm hoping by the end we'll have a little bit of time for some open questions from the audience. So you all ready? Our first question comes from Jared Stern.
I was just wondering what qualities you look for in a leader and whose leadership you admire yourselves.
Thanks, Jared. We'll start with you, Michael. Qualities of a leader, of leadership.
Well, I think a leader is somebody who, by their mind or their work, gives example and points the way. And in the field of healthcare, I had the great privilege of being there at the beginning of the HIV epidemic, because Jonathan Mann, who was a wonderful international civil servant, came out to Australia, and he invited me to join the Global Commission on AIDS. And so I was sitting there with Luc Montagnier, who was one of the winners of the Nobel Prize for discovering the HIV virus, with Françoise Banoussi, and with Robert Gallo, who developed the test for the presence of the virus, and a wonderful professor of public health from the University of Michigan, June Osborne. And so we didn't have a vaccine, we didn't have a cure, there wasn't all that much that people could do at that time. It was a really desperate moment. And so we had to think of how to address the issue. And Jonathan had a really original mind, and he said, this is full of paradoxes. And paradoxically, at this stage at least, the best way to deal with the epidemic was to reach out to, engage with, involve people who were living with HIV, and to get them to understand the presence of this virus and to protect themselves and thereby to protect the community. And that was an absolutely different way of addressing an epidemic, because up till that time, the way you addressed an epidemic was a biblical way. You just locked people up. And by the time the Global Commission was formed in 1988, I think it was already too late. I mean, there wasn't enough barbed wire in the world to adopt that. So we had to think of a new strategy, and Jonathan led the way, and he taught this, and June Osborne taught, we're not going to base our policies on intuition or hunch or prejudice or religion. We're going to base it on empirical data, sound empirical data. And so that's what these leaders did, and it was wonderful to see it. And I have to say there was a lot of opposition to this approach. And people saying, well, what are you talking about? These are people who've got a very dangerous virus. We should be locking them up and we should be punishing them. And if they spread the virus, they are enemies to society. We should have criminal laws against them. And June Osborne kept saying, no, if you have that, you will put them outside the messages, they will not get the information, and so on. So looking back on it, if I say what was the leadership in the global epidemic at that stage, it was of people who were willing to use their very considerable brain power with very few tools of a medical nature, but to try to work out what would work, and then sticking with it and insisting on it and trying to convince others of it. And New Zealand was one of the first and one of the best countries. I mean, they really embraced this quite early because they've got a very simple system of government. We've got a complicated system of government with the federal system. We followed pretty quickly because we had Neil Blewett and Peter Boehm, politicians on opposite sides of politics, but they agreed with it. And the net result of this was we did better in Australia than in most countries. And but it's because we had the leadership of very, very fine minds and people who are willing to think outside the square. So, I mean, I could talk about leadership in politics and leadership in the law and so on, but in the present context of the Doherty Institute, I think it's relevant to look back at the beginning, the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And in my life, though I rose to be a Justice of the High Court of Australia, I think the most important thing I did was trying to bring the AIDS paradox to India, because eventually even India embraced it, and eventually on LGBT rights, India embraced it in a decision of the court. But it needed leadership and it needed example and it needed proof that this was working. And that was the early days of AIDS, and it was a very frightening time, I can tell you.
Christine, what makes a good leader and whose leadership do you admire?
So what Michael's talked very eloquently about it is leadership in a particular circumstance, where people can rise to their leadership potential, which is a wonderful example of really strong, visionary, insightful leadership, and I suspect a very clear direction.
Strong is an important word.
What needs to happen. And so, but then if you, but thinking about leadership in leadership of an organisation, such as the Doherty, for example, then I think what you need in a leader is, clearly a leader is there to inspire and to lead and for people to follow their direction, assuming they're taking you in the right direction, of course. But so to be a good leader, I always think, and this is my view of the world, is that you need to be approachable, you need to be, as a leader, accessible, and you certainly need to be visible, and you need to be a great listener. And I suspect most of us probably do some of those things okay. I suspect many of us don't listen as much as we could, because you learn an enormous amount if you're listening, and you're taking information about the organisation that you're trying and doing your best to lead. So I see those as characteristics, and leading by example and a big dose of humility is one of the best. They're the characteristics, I think, in a good leader, particularly of an organisation, as perhaps distinct from a crisis. But of course, a crisis does bring out great leadership qualities or not so good leadership qualities. When it does bring out great leadership qualities, I think that's the greatest test of a good leader. If in a crisis you can lead, then you are a good leader.
Peter.
Oh, well, obviously I agree with what both Christine and with what's been said, but I think from the point of view of a research scientist, we drive our own programs, we do our own thing. So what we're looking for from a leader is, because you need an institutional structure if you're going to do science, you can't do without it, is someone who does listen, who is intelligent, and basically who's straight with you. If they agree with you, they say so. If they disagree with you, they say so. You need to know where you stand, and that's of paramount importance. And where I've had problems with leaders, it's because they chop and change, they move with every wind and so forth, and that's hopeless. So that's about it, really. I don't have anything more to say about it.
Thank you. Tim Stinier.
Just here. So this is a kind of a leadership question as well, I guess. What can scientists do that's not seen as self-serving, not asking for extra grant funding, but what can they do to ensure politicians understand and support the key roles of the sciences and education in addressing the critical public health issues of our age? That could be global warming, it could be any number of things, but what can scientists do to get the importance of sciences and education on the political agenda? Because we're at a crisis, as I see it, with respect to this at the moment.
I might ask Peter to respond to that.
Well, I think in general with public communication, and politicians are a particular case of that, because firstly they're policy makers. We elect them to govern, and of course they're under many, many more pressures than any normal citizen in society. I think, but in general, if you want to communicate about science and about issues, what you have to try to do is to show, explain, not tell. As soon as you start coming in a top-down mode from a position of authority, you lose it. And so that's what we have to do, is to try and get that discussion and explanation working in a way where people don't feel they're being lectured to, instructed. And it's actually quite difficult for a lot of university academics to do that. They're used to teaching. We're all preachy.
Michael, you might have an interesting perspective as a non-scientist.
There is a fundamental problem, I think, in the current age, and it is that if you look at the great areas of science, like nuclear fission and computers and informatics and biotech, they've all gone to a point that it is quite difficult to explain the essence of it and how it works and where you are in it to ordinary lay people. I mean, I've had computers explain to me over and over again how they work, but I defy anybody to really understand exactly how a computer works, and yet it does work. And what we need, first of all, we need lots of broadcasters who will have programs which convey what is happening in science in an informative, accurate but understandable way. And then we need scientific leaders in all of those fields and in climate change, which is so important, to explain things in a way with word pictures. A capacity to talk in word pictures is a gift, and if you can get that into your field of science to explain what is happening and why it's important and why it works and the essence of why it works, then I think you can maybe make it politically interesting and relevant. And you've got to do that, because otherwise people's eyes will glaze over and they'll just switch off and they won't be interested in what you're doing, and that will mean the moolah, the money, won't come. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to get really good communicators. Who's the best science communicator amongst top scientists that you've seen?
I think if you... Am I allowed to answer?
Yeah. Yes, maybe. Yeah, I'll let you do it. No, of course you can.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's good.
I didn't mean
We encourage a little bit of dialogue. No, please answer.
Obviously.
Actually, can I answer too? Can I also? But you go first.
Obviously, David Attenborough, Brian Cox are wonderful. I mean, if you want to turn people off science, run a program on string theory.
I'm not sure whether Peter would agree with me, and Tony Jones shouldn't have an opinion, but I would like to jump in there, because I think that one of the best communicators in this area is Tony Fauci. Tony Fauci is the head of the National Institutes for Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health. He's been in that role since 30 years. I recently went to a lecture of his where he talked about managing infectious diseases outbreaks under 6 different presidents. And if you look over time, those presidents have been pretty diverse. And yet he has this ability to tell them how important the issue is. And he has maintained an incredible budget for the NIAID, particularly in HIV, but more recently in flu, in bioterrorism, now in AMR. And it's for he's an outstanding communicator, whether it's to scientists or politicians. I don't know, Peter, whether you've had the chance to hear Tony Fauci speak much, or have you any comment on that?
I haven't heard Tony speak for a long time, but I agree with you. He's a wonderful communicator and a wonderful at being able to handle the political landscape. But you have to bear in mind, of course, that the political landscape in the United States is very, very different. Operates in a very, very different mode from the political landscape here. He's dealing with individual congressmen, senators, and the president, whereas here we're dealing with a party system. And it's a very different game, actually.
True, and the decisions can be made just at that president
Very difficult to be a
level.
Tony Fauci figure in the Australian, or even in a parliamentary model, I think.
But this does teach the fact that a person can be a great communicator. See, Ronald Reagan, everybody said, was a great communicator. He was folksy, he was simple, but during his first term as president, he could never get his magic lips around the word AIDS. And therefore, it's not skills in communication. Hitler was a great communicator. It's what the message is. And that you've got to get people in leadership positions who are not only good communicators, but have got a good message and an important message. And I think that's what we've got to do. And we've got to make sure that scientists get into the hubbub of noise that exists to communicate. Who do you think is the most effective, Christine?
Christine.
Well, I was going to take it to a different level, in the sense that I think the responsibility for scientists is to be able to, as individuals, not people who broadcast, and that's important through the media, but it's actually just at everyday level. Scientists need to be able to communicate, I think, without emotion and facts, and with simple, I don't mean simple as in dumbing down, but as in lay language, plain language, which is also consistent. The messages are consistent. And this is in everyday practice amongst yourselves. It's amongst when you, say, scientists who work talking to a CEO or to a department head or whatever it is. And it might be in Victorian government as well as in the Australian government. It's not just in public health, it's everywhere. And I think most people struggle to understand, so they just grasp what they can, the lay people, so grasp what they can, but they do struggle to understand what the key messages are. And one of the best things I've seen is the 3-minute thesis, where the PhD students in 3 minutes have to, in more or less layish language, I'll say, because it's not quite a lay audience, but explain their thesis and what they were trying to do, what they have done, and what their results are. And I think that's a wonderful skill for any up-and-coming scientist to have, to be able to explain. So when the opportunity comes, you can explain what you're trying to do and why it's important, because presumably it is, why it's important to society.
It's interesting that Christine says this, because I've just heard that I will probably be invited to go to Rome on the 5th of April for a private audience with the Pope about the issue of the criminal laws against gays in countries and why they should be repealed. And I've got 3 minutes. Now,
No slides.
no pressure. But how do you convey a complex issue? I think the answer is...
Do you want to practice on us?
Jonathan Mann considered at the very first big meeting of the Global Commission, he insisted that there would be people on that commission who were living with HIV, who were gay people, who would speak about the issues, because his theory was if you can see a human being and they tell you what their burden is and what the problem from their point of view is, then our natural human instinct is towards problem solving. And I think that's what I've got to turn my mind to, the 3 minutes, to convince Pope Francis that that's something that should be done.
You can say a lot in 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Peter, would you make a comment?
We're living in an information world which is rapidly transformed in very substantial ways. And I'd like to back up what Christine said, is the science communicators are each and every one of us. Aware scientists, we can use mechanisms like Twitter to tweet, say, something we've read online, bring it to general attention, and particularly for those of us who are lab-based, if we have great visual material, we should put it up on YouTube and so people can see it. I think what actually might be a good idea is if within the Institute we had a discussion day where we had real insight from people who've thought about this a lot, talking to everyone about how we communicate.
Miller McLean.
Antimicrobial resistance is a huge global threat that affects all demographics of society in all regions of the world. How do you envision our response as scientists and global citizens to this major threat?
I might ask Michael to answer that, because we were just talking about a similar discussion you were having in India.
My only experience with this problem, multi-drug resistant issues, has been with tuberculosis and in the work of a high-level panel set up by Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon to address this very issue. What can we do about it? I mean, you can't just demand that scientists find an answer to it. It doesn't work like that. Though the Manhattan Project showed that if you throw enough money at a problem, a lot can be done in a relatively short time. So it's a question of prioritising this issue. I don't think most people out there in our country and in other countries know what a serious issue this is. But I was last week in Mumbai and it was a conference on HIV and HCV and what could be done. But the conversation turned to Candida. And so this is not a virus, this is not a bacterium, this is a fungal condition. And the question that they were presenting was, how do we deal with this in the context that some forms of Candida in India are multi-drug resistant? And some of the speakers said, well, we've got to go back to basics, and the basics will be we've got to insist upon and ensure there is observance of the old rule about washing your hands between patient contact. And often in hospital settings, actually a public hospital in India, the photos were put on the screen of the overcrowded public hospitals in India. And what can we do in these ultra busy places, desperately busy, dealing with thousands of people, to ensure the simple rule of people washing their hands and keeping hand hygiene? And of course, Semmelweis, when he introduced this in Vienna and Hungary, people laughed at him. They said, well, if I can't see the germs, I don't believe they exist. And he had a terrible fight to do this, but ultimately he won because he got his students to write to institutions all over Europe saying, these are the figures. Empiricism is evidence, is what scientists have to get over, and that is the evidence of a very dangerous problem, and we've got to address it in both biomedically but also in ordinary standard practices.
I'm sure Christine might want to follow up on that.
So look, clearly it is something I don't think the community is aware, just as you said, Michael, is aware of the potential problems of this. The second is hospitals, if you just talk about hospitals, they're just one part of this whole issue, has certainly got all sorts of systems with antimicrobial stewardship, etc., and guidelines, and we've improved enormously, but I'm sure there's a lot more we could do, and most of that work, of course, comes from the great clinicians here at the Doherty. But there's more we can do, because it's still, you know, this is what you do, and we then audit whether we do what we should do, but, you know, no one quite gets punished for doing the wrong thing. So I think there's much more we could do in the hospitals. But the big issue, I think, it seems to me, is out in the community. And so general practitioners, and they're in a very difficult space, because patients come in, and most of them, when they have a common cold, expect an antibiotic. And so it's easier to write a script, get them out, and we're all under pressure. So it's the public education, to me, is a huge issue. We did it brilliantly with tobacco, we've done it brilliantly with seatbelts, all sorts of issues in this country. I would have thought that was one thing we probably have the potential to do across Australia. So education of the community, and then that works with general practice. I know that's only one of the components, but it's a very big component of this.
Can I ask you, Sharon, you know, in law, the teaching of legal history is dying. They say, oh, we just study the statutes and we don't need to know all that stuff about where it came from. But in medicine, I mean, medical history is really very important, especially in epidemics and addressing epidemics. Do people in a medical course in Australia get taught about the struggle of Semmelweis in Vienna and how all his colleagues opposed his idea of washing your hands with chlorine, and he had a terrible battle with it. Do they get taught that now in an ordinary medical course? They should, I think.
I would say there's not a lot of history in the standard medical course, and there is a little bit of that attitude of things are very different now than they were once, but issues around advocacy
what has the 19th
and false
century got
news
to teach us?
I mean, I'm sure Peter would have a view of this, bringing in totally new ways or theories of looking at things. You often are up against a lot of naysayers, so those principles are still the same. And some fundamentals of medicine are unrelated to technological advances. They're
Jonathan Mann used to organise these meetings in Annecy, just outside of Geneva in France. And it was the Pasteur Institute had an establishment there, and the scientists used to come along, and there were lots of Nobel winners, and they used to say, eventually we'll get on top of this, because epidemics historically burn themselves out, that comes to a point where they burn themselves out. But what if these microbes that are now causing the problem in antimicrobial resistance don't burn themselves out? And what are we doing about this issue? And do politicians know about this problem? Do our leaders know? Does the community know about them? Are you doing enough to communicate this to the general community? Because I've gone to 100 AIDS conferences and I don't really remember Candida being a major issue. But in India, Mumbai last week, that's what everybody was talking about. And so that, you know, you can learn something new every conference.
Peter?
Yeah, I mean, everything that's been said is true, and of course, but one of the big issues in this, as we all understand, is that the actual pipelines are very empty, so to speak. That we've got very few backup drugs for some very, very serious infectious disease problems. And the issue there really is that not enough resources are going in, and part of the reason for that is the economics of the whole drug industry and antibacterials and all the rest of it, with great numbers of generics and so forth being produced in countries like India and all the rest of it. So what we really need, I think, we've had some of it from Gates, but of course what Gates can do is not unlimited. We need a much more sort of global public policy funding type response to this issue, because it is a very dangerous situation.
Why would there not be? I mean, this is not a problem only of the developing world. No. This is a problem of rich countries and rich people, and it's therefore in our interest to invest in this. And if they can find solutions to multi-drug resistant conditions, then there'll be a lot of money for those who do it. Now, why is the money not flowing?
It's not a big market on the whole. It's a very limited market. You're not going to sell much product.
Yes, but if in hospitals, you know, this becomes a major issue, because today you don't have a problem confined in Vietnam or in Malawi. I mean, with aeroplanes, problems spread very rapidly throughout the world.
It's actually few people who are affected. That's part of the problem. I mean, what the drug companies love is Lipitor. You take it every day for the rest of your life.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a winner.
I'm not knocking it.
Or the AIDS, or the AIDS drug.
Just an ordinary old aspirin will do. I mean, if you take that every
They
day.
don't love aspirin because it's out of patent, and they can't make any money out of it.
Cheap.
And you know, you can go back and you can find actually aspirin is sometimes a lot better than a lot of much more expensive drugs, but none of the drug companies are going to succeed.
The high-level panel actually recommended a solution very similar to what you said. It said this is a global problem. The World Health Organization has to take leadership. It has to be something, it's a public good. It has to be done out of public funds. But whether that will happen, you know, and whether the money, big money, will plunge into it.
Well, people like Seth Barkley with Garvey and so forth kind of show some sort of way, but you have to involve big resources in this, and you can't expect industry to put it up if they're not making a profit, except as part of their sort of general good.
Well, yes, and the history of AIDS was that a lot of those drugs which we later used, they were developed in the public sector. They were developed in either universities or independent institutes. They weren't developed in the private sector. The private sector, as you say, tends to zero in on what's going to make a lot of money. That's how the market operates.
And you know, if you're going to deliver a drug in India or Africa, you've got to deliver it at 5 cents a dose or something.
Rebecca Elliott. I can't see Rebecca. There she is.
As you mentioned earlier, Justice Kirby, just last week a senior commentator in the US came out and said he can't see germs, therefore they don't exist. At the same time, the World Health Organization rates vaccine hesitation as one of the key public health issues for 2019. How do we operate in such a vexed environment?
Well, this is really a segue to the last question. Who could possibly be such an ignorant official to say such a thing. And I mean, this is really worrying that people rise to positions of power and responsibility and they're just plain ignorant. But this is not new. This is the problem that Ignaz Semmelweis had with his colleagues. They for some reason, it's hard to look back on it, you know, when he said, well, you should be washing your hands with chlorine, and I can show that when you do that, between, say, dealing with a cadaver and then dealing with a birth delivery, that you reduce radically. And in fact, it's better to be delivered at home than to be delivered in a hospital where the diseases mix. But as I said earlier, he got his students to write with the data. And this is really the strength of science, is data and rational thought. And getting the data, collecting the data and communicating it in a way that people will understand is, I think, the key. And you would just have to answer ignorance and I'll put it gently, misapprehension or stupidity with actual data and information. But scientists have got to be more proactive about that. It's a bit like lawyers, you know, you can work at your bench or you can work on your case, but people have to extrapolate from the particular into communicating to politicians and decision makers and bureaucrats what's over the horizon. And I'm not sure that our scientific community in Australia is all that good at doing that.
And I think it's probably a bit more complex now with the rise of, you know, fake news and mistrust in experts. So you've got an alternate voice there as well. Peter might want to comment on that.
Well, you know, the question of, people sometimes ask, if you were to start in science again, what would you study? I probably wouldn't be immunology, but I always thought neuroscience. But the more I've tried to communicate with people, and the more I've watched, for instance, the rise of Trump and this type of figure, the more I think that if I was to start again, I'd actually study psychiatry. Because I think everyone's mad. I mean, you know, we're apes with big brains. We choose what's convenient to us. And that's a problem. And you can be, it doesn't matter what science communicators do. You cannot break through this without the help of professional communicators with insight into how to draw people forward in different directions. There's a limit to what we can do.
I might just change tack a bit, so I'm going to go a little bit out of order here and talk about something a bit away from science and more broadly what's facing us in Australia, and Sandy West.
Thank you. There's an upcoming election in Australia, likely to be fought on issues of border security and maybe climate change. What should our politicians be debating? What are the key issues facing Australia today?
I might ask Christine to respond to that.
So those issues that you've mentioned are important issues, but if we're talking about health, I think we're in a health audience, I think the key issues is the health system. And that involves not just the public health system, the private health system and the primary care system. And the fact is, in many ways, we always talk about this, and it's true, we have an extraordinary standard of healthcare in this country, and that's terrific. But, gosh, it could be a heck of a lot better. And the fundamental problem we have, it's not integrated. So the divide between the Commonwealth and the state means that there's cost shifting, and maybe that doesn't matter, that's behind the scenes in a way, but it is also
Is
this...
this what should we be talking about in the election?
So one is the divide between the Commonwealth and the state. So basically the Commonwealth governs, if you like, and funds the primary care sector, and the state funds essentially, with some help from the Commonwealth, but funds and operates the hospital sector. And so you've got two very separate sectors, and we all try and work hand in hand, but That's one of the big challenges. That's not new, but what is new or newish is the growing demand for health services, the growing expectation, which is totally appropriate, of consumers, patients who come to our sector, the ageing population. And so we have many problems facing us, and if we don't have an integrated system, it's going to be harder, much harder. So I think that's one of the big issues, and how's the private sector, which seems to me to be wobbling a bit at the moment, a bit uncertain, a bit unclear, how did that fit in? I'm a great believer of private, public, no problems, but how do we all work together, and what is the place, if you like, of the private sector versus the public sector? I think there's a lot of difficulties in the way we deliver health in this country. It's good, but it could be a lot better, and we have a lot of challenges ahead of, this country has a lot of challenges ahead of it.
Michael, the question was around the key issues facing Australia today and what our politicians should be debating. That there's this very heavy emphasis on border security and climate change, for example, but what are the big issues that you'd like to be seeing debated at the next election?
We've had a very debased discussion about climate change. It's really just been people screaming at each other. As I understand it, what the opponents of taking climate change seriously say is we don't dispute that there is change in the climate. We're just saying we don't think it's human caused and that it's just something that changes over time. And the thalidomide debates taught us that you can't just necessarily take up scientific wisdom at a particular time. You've always got to retain a certain scepticism in case majority wisdom turns out to be wrong and on the wrong track. So what does an ordinary layperson do in that circumstances? Well, what you normally do is, you look to majority wisdom and you test majority wisdom. You put very clever people in the areas of discipline and you try to work out where the probabilities lie. And that's what politicians have to sift for us and then go and run with it and advocate it. Now, most politicians have come to a conclusion on both political groupings that there is climate change, that it is serious, and that it is human contributed, and therefore that we have to change things and do things about it. And but that raises this issue of false news. The sceptics say you can't get our point of view over into the media because they just won't tolerate it. And but the others say, well, we won't tolerate it because it's just false news and it's just not scientific. And that's where a layperson really needs the assistance of the scientific community to tell them what is right and what is not right. But there are plenty of other things where we've got issues on our plate which are very important for us in Australia. I think for the election, public education is very important. You know, I'm a product of public education. And I know Peter was educated in public schools, and you know when you see the decline of public education, of the money being given to public education, and the loss of opportunity that means to a nation, then that is really concerning. And so I hope that's going to be really seriously discussed. And certainly, as far as our Aboriginal population is concerned, we've got to face up to the fact that they are in a very disadvantageous position in health, housing, welfare and education, and that we've got to put our money where it's no good just at every meeting. I do it myself, acknowledging the traditional owners and so on. You know, money is what we've got to divert money. They lost their land. When they lost their land, they lost the wherewithal to get the health, education and housing. And until we go beyond symbols and polite statements at conferences into actually devoting money to the Aboriginal people whose land was stolen, as they say, taken, as we say, then we're not going to make much progress. And that's going to be to the shame of Australia, I think. Politicians should be coming together about those sorts of issues and putting it outside the realm of party politics.
Peter?
Well, I concur with Michael on the public education thing because, of course, we are an immigrant country, and one of the ways you bring an immigrant country forward is to make sure that everyone gets a good basic education. And I think we probably, we have a more divided education system than almost any other country on earth, in fact. And we use public tax dollars to drive that, which seems to me to be crazy. But it's a very difficult political issue, as we all understand. With respect to climate change, which I thought about a lot, I think the actual numbers of real deniers are falling off very rapidly because of what's been happening. It's not nearly as substantial factor as it was, say, 10 years ago. But the problem is that it's a global problem. And so when, say, local politicians say, well, we can put in a new coal-burning power plant, and it won't have much effect. And that's actually true if you think in a global sense. It won't. I mean, it removes any capacity we have to take a moral position in global negotiations, but actually it won't have much effect. So that's part of the kind of bind that the political right has got caught in Australia. Somehow or other, we have to get long-term policy on this. We can't go from a situation where one side does something, the other side does something else, because it's totally unproductive. And I think particularly what I think of as the Abbott years, which I think are still continuing, have been particularly bad in that respect because it was a purely confrontational model and it doesn't work. So we've got to hope we'll get a better political landscape after this next election. And I think there may be some possibility of that with all these independents standing, and also some people coming into the right-hand side of politics who are more back in that liberal mode than less in the sort of everything for the rich mode that we've been accustomed to. So I think that's what we need. We also need to think, there's also the enormous economic threat that all this poses to us. And we realise, in a sense, that we're going to have to get off fossil fuels as our big earner, but can we really do it, and how do we do it? That's an enormously difficult issue. I think if we focused a lot more on resilience, particularly in the health system, for instance, that would be a very productive way to go. I think if we focused on things which would actually drive economic opportunity, and building resilience is one of those, we might do better politically. But it's an extraordinarily difficult problem for each and every one of us, in fact, and certainly for politicians.
I wouldn't mind if you commented a little bit about the discussions on border security, because that really taps into some very important issues around human rights and touches a potentially undesirable.
I mean, most of, as we all know, I mean, border security is like Trump's wall. We've had this moral justification, we don't want people to drown at sea, but that's not really what it's about. I mean, we know that most of the people who seek to enter this country illegally don't come on a boat, they come on a plane. So we've got to stop the planes. I'd be all for that. It'd be great for climate change. I wouldn't have to go to international meetings, I could go to the beach. It'd be fantastic.
Michael, any comment? Border security unleashes all of these views from people around refugees, etc.
Well, a country does have a right in international law to control those who come in without its permission. But I mean, if you look at Germany and countries in Europe, they've absorbed a million and more, whereas we're talking about really what in global terms is a trickle. And actually one good thing in Australia would be if we told the story of more of our refugees, if we adopted Jonathan Mann's lesson of actually putting a face to a problem and then explaining to people what sacrifices so many of these people will make in order to try and get out of desperate situations. On Monday of this week, I went to a conference where a young man spoke who was a Kurdish Iraqi, and he was one of the LGBT minority in that country, and he made the point that Saddam Hussein was actually better for women, for people who like to drink, and for gays than the religious people who've taken his place. We Australians were part of the coalition of the willing, and we've therefore got a moral responsibility to do something about these things. But getting a face, getting a voice, communicating and explaining this issue and putting it in context, I think would be a whole lot. And there are so many other issues we need to address. But yesterday in Queensland, the Parliament of Queensland adopted a Human Rights Act. And it does show that when you've got leadership and when you've got political judgment, you can achieve things in Australia, but it sometimes takes an awful long time.
I mean, what Michael says is completely true. I mean, Saddam, for all the horrible characteristics he showed and his regime showed, was a Ba'athist secular regime, which was also the case in Syria, I think. And knocking off those regimes to replace them with theocratic models is a disaster. I mean, there's nothing more disastrous across the planet, with the possible exception of the Republic of Ireland, than theocratic regimes. You have to separate church and state. And that's one of the problems I have with our schooling model. We have broken the separation between church and state.
We have a lot...
I annoyed Howard with that. Annoying Howard was always pleasant.
We have many more questions. I'm going to just ask for one final question from Miranda Smith.
Thanks, Sharon. There are big equity issues in the medical research environment, including a lack of women in senior leadership and research positions, underrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and limited opportunities for people living with disabilities. A more equitable workplace has the potential to be more inclusive, more innovative, and more productive. But how can we ensure that the pursuit of equity is not sidelined in the pursuit of scientific excellence?
I think this is for Christine.
I was just about to say this is not for Christine. Christine will speak. I'm going to ask you to comment first, Michael.
It's a tough one, this one.
Well, first of all, I think if you have an equitable environment, it's going to be a happy environment generally. It's a bit like law firms not requiring that LGBT people be silent about their sexual identity. And then, as it is often said, they bring their whole person to work. And for most of my life, I was silent, and I didn't bring my whole person to work, and that was how it was in those days. But things are changing in all sorts of environments, even in the High Court of Australia. I mean, that was my workspace, a rather refined workspace, but that was where I worked. But I defer to Christine and to Peter about how you encourage scientific excellence, and so, because in the end, Watson of Watson and Crick turns out to be a man with lots of very rather strange points of view. He's obviously a very brilliant man, and he's very important in the history of science, but you know, he has views which, from an outsider's point of view, tend to seem a bit racist. I'm not asking you to be responsible for every Nobel scientist, but basically their basic answer is science is science, and brilliance and breakthroughs, luck plays a part, and application and devotion and hard work plays a very big part. But I think you're not necessarily going to have the totally lovely people. Some of them are going to be rather unlovely people, and how you then mix that with an work environment which is progressive and cooperative is a real issue, I think.
Christine and Peter are both desperate to talk. I'm just thinking who should get the last word, but I'm going to ask Peter and then Christine will get the last word.
Specifically, I've known Jim Watson for years. He's an interesting guy with a sort of rather clear and unique vision, but there's a time, and I've been asking him this for a while, when we should all be pulled off the public stage. And Jim didn't have someone who did that for him, unfortunately. The other thing with respect to the equity issue, I think if you look just at what we have here, I mean, we have the head of Melbourne Health, we have the head of the Institute, Fabienne sitting in the audience. I think the microbiology, immunology area in general has been rather better at bringing women forward than almost any other. And we still probably don't have 50-50, but we have pretty good, a reasonable balance, and we have some very promising young women coming ahead in this institute. I've done what I can to promote the careers of young women, including, I think the program grants that we had were extremely good for protecting young women through those childbearing years because they were group-type grants. So I think we could certainly do more, and if we could disseminate our culture a bit more broadly, that would be excellent.
Could I just mention one fact?
I knew I'd have a tough time.
When we got married, Johan and I, we chose a research scientist at the Kirby Institute in Sydney and a woman to be our marriage celebrant. She's a bench scientist, and that was the sort of person we wanted to be our marriage celebrant, and she did a fantastic job. Her name is Michelle Bailey, in case anybody here wants a research scientist who in part-time is a marriage celebrant. A little bit of free advertisement here.
And final word from Christine.
I'll remember that, Michael. So I don't know Watson, but I'll bring it back to perhaps in a hospital and a health service. And I guess my message is diversity is really important, and people bringing themselves to the workplace fully is really, really important. In health, as we all know, it's now very much about teamwork. You know, it's doctors, nurses, allied health, and non-clinical people all working together, and you won't get a good outcome unless everybody works together. So how people communicate with each other, respect each other, have the same good values with each other, respect the differences but still respect each other is absolutely fundamental. We talk a lot about being a great place to work, great place to receive care, and a great place to work. And so the great place to work, we now know, if the culture of the organisation is very much a culture of safety, then you are going to have better outcomes for your patients, better experience for patients. There's good data to show it. And so I think it comes back to diversity, equity, all those words, women involved. The full gamut is really, really important. And do we do it well? Well, we can do it better, but we're trying hard to do it better because that will drive good outcomes, excellence, creativity, innovation, which is what you need in science and what you need in healthcare.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the hour. And before I ask you to join me in thanking our panel, I wanted to let you all know the Institute seminars on the 7th of March, and from 12 to 1 p.m. We have Professor Erling Norby. Professor Norby is an eminent Swedish scientist who has been very involved with the selection of Nobel laureates over many years, and his title of his talk will be Nobel Prizes, the Central Dogma and the Genetic Code. I think it will be a fascinating seminar. I would like to, first of all, thank all of the people that sent in questions and apologise to each of you for not getting to your question. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time, and I was trying to get a range of questions. They were all very thoughtful, and I really want to appreciate you sending them in. A very special thank you to Andrea Fisher and to the comms team that put a lot of thought and effort and work into trying to make today a bit like Q&A on TV, which I want to thank them for that. I have a book, Marsha Langton's Welcome to Country. I hope many of you know this book. Marsha is a very senior academic here at the University of Melbourne, one of our few senior Indigenous academics. It's a wonderful book on Indigenous Australia, I have a copy for each of you. Thank you, Michael, Christine, thank you, Peter, and thanks again to our audience.